All right, kiddos, it is an exciting time. Edmund has made it all the way to the White Witch's castle, and they are getting in the sledge, and the White Witch is trying to get to the children, Peter, Susan, and Lucy, before they could see Aslan. And Edmund has given her all the information. Edmund, what were you thinking? All right, let's see what's happening, because the book now says, now we must look back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the 3 other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, there's no time to lose, everyone began bundling themselves into coats except for Mrs. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table and said, now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that ham, and there's a packet of tea, and there's sugar and some matches. She's a good mom, isn't she? She's going to make sure they have snacks. And if someone will get 2 or 3 loaves of bread over out of the crock in the corner. What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver? Exclaimed Susan. Packing a load for each of us, dearie, said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. You didn't think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, did you? Do you guys, when you go on a journey, do you pack up tons of snacks? You know what? That never goes away. Even Mr. Chris and I were talking about going on a little journey, and we're like, ooh, and in the car we'll take all these snacks. But we haven't time, said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. She may be here any minute. That's what I said, chimed in Mr. Beaver. Get along with you all, said his wife. Think it over, Mr. Beaver. She can't be here for a quarter of an hour at least. But don't we want a big start as we could get as possible, said Peter, if we're to reach the stone table before her? You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver, said Susan. And soon as she looked in here, she finds we're going to be off at the top speed. So they're all saying, come on, we got to go. And Mrs. Beaver's like, oh, we have a quarter hour. That's 15 minutes. That's not very long. I think this time I might have gone without the snacks. That she will, said Miss Beaver, but we can't get there before her, whatever we do, so she'll be on the sledge and we'll be walking. Then we have no hope, said Susan. Now don't you get fussy there, little dearie, said Mrs. Beaver, but just get half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer. Mrs. Beaver's so funny. She's like, we can't beat her anyway, because she'll have a sledge and we're walking, so we might as well take the snacks and get some nice hankies with that. Of course we have hope, she said. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways that she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through. So she had another plan. That's true enough, Mrs. Beaver, said her husband, but it's time we were getting out of here. And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver, said his wife. There, that's better. There's 5 loads, and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, dearie, she added, looking at Lucy. Oh, little loaves of bread for everyone. Oh, do please come on, said Lucy. Well, I'm nearly ready now, said Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to keep her into her snow boots, help her into her snow boots. I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring? I love Mrs. Beaver. Not only does she want to bring snacks, but she's like, can we bring the sewing machine? Remember, that's what she was doing when the kids entered the beaver dam the first time? She was sewing. Yes, it is too heavy, said Mr. Beaver. A great deal too heavy. And you don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run, do you? I can't abide the thought of that white witch fiddling with it, said Mrs. Beaver, and breaking it or stealing it, or likely as not. Oh, please, please, please do hurry, said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. It'll delay her a bit, he said, and they set off carrying their loads over their shoulders. The snow had stopped, and the moon had come out when they began their journey. They went in single file, first Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, then Mrs. Beaver, last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and on the right side of the river bank, and then along a very rough sort of path among the trees right down by the river bank. The sides of the valley, shining in the moonlight, towered up far above them on either side. Best kept down here as much as possible, he said. She'll have to keep on the top, for you couldn't bring a sledge down here. So the river's down here, and there's big sides, and so they're staying right down on the low part because she's saying in the big sledge, she has to stay up there. It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at if there was a window to look through and a comfortable armchair. And even if things were like this, Lucy enjoyed it at first. So they're saying it was a really pretty little thing if you were just sitting inside, maybe a fire, cup of tea, an armchair, but it was still pretty even if they were on the run. And Lucy stopped, looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with its waterfalls of ice and the white masses on the treetops and the great glaring moon and the countless stars, and could only watch the short little legs of Mr. Beaver going pad, 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 pad through the snow in front of her as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared and the snow began to fall once more. At last Lucy was so tired that she was almost asleep and walking at the same time, when suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the riverbank to the right and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then she came fully awake when she found Mr. Beaver just vanishing into a little hole in the bank which had been almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. So she was following him, and he's just walking. She was almost falling asleep walking. Then all of a sudden he went uphill and into a little hole. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing. Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. "Wherever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. I hope you know what I mean by a voice sounding pale. I think that means kind of weak, right? "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and it's a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we must get a few hours of sleep." So we found like a little hole for them, kind of like a little cave for them to sneak in and hide and sleep. "If you hadn't all been in such a plaguey fuss when we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. "Oh, Mrs. Beaver," she's like, "see, if you guys were not throwing such a fuss, I would have had pillows for you in addition to the food and, maybe her sewing machine." It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought, but just a hole in the ground, but dry and earthy. It was very small, so that when they all lay down, they were a bundle of clothes together. And what with that and being warmed up by their long walk, they were rather snug. If only the floor of the cave had been a little smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in the little dark a little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and sputter and a little and sting the throat, but it also made you feel deliciously warm after you swallowed it, and everyone went straight to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, though it was really hours and hours later, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff and thinking how she would like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek and saw the cold daylight coming in through the mouth of the cave. But immediately after that she was very wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, listening to a sound which was the very sound they'd all been thinking of, and sometimes imagining they heard during their walk last night. It was the sound of jingle bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash, and the moment he heard it, perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do, but it was really a very sensible one. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among the bushes and the brambles without being seen, and he wanted above all things to see which way the White Witch's sledge went. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. I think Mr. Beaver's pretty brave, don't you? But he knew he could scramble and get out there, but he was still very brave. They waited nearly 5 minutes. Then they heard something that frightened them all very much. They heard voices. "Oh," thought Lucy, "he's been seen. She's caught him." Great was their surprise when a little later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling to them from just outside the cave. "It's all right," he was shouting. "Come out, Mrs. Beaver! Come out, sons and daughters of Adam! It's all right! It isn't her!" This was bad grammar, of course, but that is how beavers talk when they are excited. I mean, in Narnia, in our world, they usually don't talk at all, do they? So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bundling out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight, with their earth all over them. They were covered in dirt. And looking very frosty and unbrushed and uncombed, with the sleep in their eyes. "Come on," cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. "Come and see. This is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks like her power is already crumbling." Boom. Tomorrow we're going to find out who it was. So we know it's not the White Witch. Who could it be? Someone he was very excited to see. I'll see you tomorrow, guys.